Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome. Very glad to have you here. My name is Josh Paul. I'm co-founder and director of A New Policy. We're an organization dedicated to shifting American politics that are preventing better policies and that are limiting free speech and debate on the US approach to Palestine and Israel. Today's webinar is the first of many that we will be holding on a regular basis. Please encourage your friends and colleagues to sign up to our mailing list, which can be found on our website, and I think that there is a link that you will find being dropped in the chat. I also want to say, as this is our very first event, we welcome your feedback. Please do send us any thoughts you have, whether on the technical aspects, on the substance, things you would like to hear A New Policy addressed in future webinars by sending us an email to info@anewpolicy.org. That's info@anewpolicy.org. So today, I'm going to be joined in conversation, and I'm actually really thrilled and honored to be joined in conversation by Yousef Munayyer. Yousef is head of the Palestine-Israel program, and he's a senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Yousef and I will be discussing the recently published paper from A New Policy called Not in America's Interest: Why Unconditional Support for Israel is Bad for America and Bad for Americans. This paper, which you may have seen there was a link to in the registration, explains and assesses how the US continues to disregard international law, how it's alienating its allies, jeopardizing its national security interests, and all of this in order to provide its unqualified support for Benjamin Netanyahu's extremist government. Again, you can find a link to that paper in the Zoom chat. So let me just quickly introduce Yousef a little bit more. So Yousef Munayyer is head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. He also serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies and was previously executive director of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Some of his published articles can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, the Journal of Palestine Studies, Middle East Policy, and others. Dr. Munayyer holds a PhD in International Relations and Comparative Politics from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Yousef. And finally, just an admin note before we begin. If we have time, we'll incorporate audience questions as we go along, and particularly towards the back end of this 1-hour webinar. Please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature found on your screen. So all of that said, let's crack on, and let me just hand it over first to Yousef for any opening thoughts you might want to share with us all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh, and let me just start by saying thank you for having me here. It's an honor to participate in this first webinar that you guys are putting together, and a big congratulations to you and the team at A New Policy for getting this kicked off, and for the paper that you have now put out there into the world, which is going to be part of our conversation today. It's really great to see. And I thought, obviously looking through the paper and sort of the framing of it in some ways reminded me of many conversations that I've had over previous years when thinking through sort of the ways to advocate for a shift in U.S. policy. And there are a couple of different approaches that one can take. We can broadly characterize them as sort of an interest-based one, which is, I think, the framing that this paper seeks to sort of follow. And then another could be characterized as a more values-based one. Obviously, there's overlap between these two. But I was interested to see that you guys went about it this way, and I think it's an important framing for many spaces here in DC and beyond. And I would just love to hear more from you, perhaps as we get started, to understand why you decided to write this particular paper and take the approach that you did in this sort of opening salvo for A New Policy.
Yeah, no, thank you, Yousef. And just to pick up on a point you made right there, I think that ultimately the pursuit, as you said, there's a values approach and an interests approach. I think when America is functioning at its best, we recognize that there is actually a significant overlap between those two, that acting in accordance with our values is in our interest and is what makes us stand out from a lot of the competitors around the world. And that's just one of the many areas in which, by providing unconditional support to Israel, we are not only running against our own interests in many ways, but we are also clearly running against our values, which of course in turn weakens us on the global stage, undermines our credibility, because our credibility is based in many ways on our values. When it comes down to why we decided to write this paper, and this is the first policy paper that the organization put out, I think it's because there is this unhelpful consensus in American politics. If you look at the Republicans and the Democrats on, almost every issue, it's a competition between them. It's a fight over, what is the right approach? Is it this? Is it that? When it comes to US support for Israel, it's not a competition, it's a race. And it's a race to see who can be the most pro-Israel, right? And we've had now 2 presidents in a row, Prime Minister Netanyahu come to Washington and say, this is the most pro-Israel, president the United States has ever had. And so, I think we wanted to take that pretty flawed national consensus and just sort of tear it apart a bit and ask that question of, okay, everyone across the political spectrum, well, not everyone, but many across the political spectrum, particularly in the establishments, are basing all of this off a single assumption that America's interests and Israel's interests are inseparable. And when you start to look at it, not only are they very separable, but often they're actually in conflict, that what is in our interest is not necessarily what is in Israel's interest, and vice versa. And of course, there's another layer to this as well, right? When we talk about the actions of any country, we use that unitary American interest, Israeli interest. But of course, in the context of Israel right now as well, we also see, I think we would argue, a divergence between what is actually in Israel's long-term interests versus what is in the interests of Prime Minister Netanyahu and those right-wing extremists with whom he is surrounding himself and who make up much of the governing coalition there. So we just wanted to break that down and try to ask that question and sort of poke at that assumption that there is no difference between America's interests and Israel's interests. And on that note, I think we planned this webinar a couple of weeks ago, and we knew that Prime Minister Netanyahu was going to be in town this week. What we didn't know was exactly what that was going to look like, what President Trump was going to say, and what that was going to lead to, and actually to bring in some breaking news that some in the audience may not yet have heard. At 2:30 this afternoon Eastern time, that's just over an hour from now, President Trump will be signing a new executive order sanctioning the International Criminal Court in connection with his prosecution of Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Gallant. I think we'll come back to that as we talk through the paper later in the discussion, but I wanted to flag that at the top, particularly for any activists or advocates in the audience. But it's been a crazy week up till this point, even without taking that into account, particularly with Donald Trump's proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza, right? And then for the US to take ownership of the territory. And, Yousef, you had said, I think it was in Foreign Policy, that, quote, there's a long list of adjectives we could run through to describe that, to describe Trump's proposal. You said outrageous, criminal, harebrained. How much time do you have? So let me ask you, Yousef, just as we get into this and also recognize where we are this week, how real do you think this is? Is the US actually going to become the occupying power in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. I think it is so important to start with this, since it has kind of dominated the conversation over the last several days. When it was first announced that Netanyahu was coming here, of course, was not particularly surprised, and it reminded me of the first Trump administration. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu was his first foreign guest, official guest. At that time, they met likewise then in early February. they had a press conference. And if you'll remember, of course, at the time, this was just a few weeks after the Obama administration had ended, and the Obama administration had ended on a sort of very loud note when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, with an abstention on a UN resolution related to Israeli settlements. It called for something of a strict timeline for progress towards a two-state solution. And that was sort of the context in which Benjamin Netanyahu had come to Washington the last time. And Kerry, at the time, Secretary of State John Kerry, had just given this lengthy address after spending several years trying to restart some kind of talks between Israelis and Palestinians to no avail. And he talked about the importance of trying to save a two-state solution, and how critical it was, particularly for Israel, and saving a Jewish and democratic state, and all of this sort of talk. And then, a few weeks later, Netanyahu shows up to Washington, D.C. He meets with Donald Trump. And one of the first things that Donald Trump says that caught everybody off guard and was really, the talk of the town for a little while is, well, I don't know, one state, two state, I'm looking at all kinds of options, right? This was President Trump at the time. And so, when I heard Netanyahu, of course, was going to be his first guest again, this is one of the first things that I thought about, and thought, what kind of outrageous thing is Donald Trump going to say now? Of course, the context in this moment is very different. We're not talking about some kind of abstract solution that may or may not be negotiated years down the line. We're talking about a very real crisis on the ground. We're talking about a very delicate stage of the implementation of a ceasefire agreement, moving from one phase to the next, which is ultimately supposed to lead to the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip after 15 months of a genocidal campaign there, backed by the United States. And so in that sense, we're, of course, in a very different moment. To answer your question, no, I don't think that this is going to happen. I don't understand how it could possibly work. I mean, not to mention, of course, it is a flagrant violation of international law, something that it seems that everybody other than Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his right-wing allies in Israel are opposed to. It's impossible to see how this actually happens. Now, Donald Trump tries to say and do a lot of different things, but to get things like this to actually happen, it takes a lot more than just what a president says or thinks. You can't just take over another people's territory. It just doesn't work like that. How he's going to sort of move people out of there, then impose them on somebody else, and then finance a reconstruction of Gaza that would only be American. It doesn't make any sense, right? And I think we also need to see this in this moment in the context of Israeli domestic politics, but also the ceasefire negotiations, or the second stage of ceasefire negotiations, which are going to be taking place and are supposed to have started taking place now. The Israelis have refused from the outset to talk about what happens at the end of this war. They say they don't want Hamas there, but they also don't want any other Palestinians there. And nobody else is signing up for taking control of Gaza. There needs to be some kind of administrative mechanism for the implementation of reconstruction, if that's ever going to happen. And so this question needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed ASAP for it to ever take place. Part of this, crazy idea from Trump may be about trying to present a very extreme negotiating position as he begins to engage now alongside the Israelis in conversations about this second stage and what comes after with other players in the region, including in the Gulf and in Egypt as well. It's impossible to tell. But yeah, on top of being criminal, it's not going to happen. And I just want to say something here about Egypt as well. We've seen a number of statements come from the region, from the Jordanians, from the Egyptians, from the Saudis in response to Donald Trump. Not only do these countries not want to participate in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, because of what it would mean for them within the region to have gone along with something like this. But they also view it, particularly for the Egyptians, they view it as a direct challenge to their vital national interests. People forget that the Egyptians made peace with Israel, and they made peace with Israel. The deal there was that they were going to reclaim sovereign Egyptian territory in the Sinai. That's the foundation of that bargain, right? That was not an easy sell for the Egyptian leadership to the Egyptian people. In fact, it ultimately cost Egypt tremendously in the Arab world, and it cost Anwar Sadat his life, right? But the payoff there was that Egypt was going to reclaim sovereignty over its national territory. By accepting that a foreign population, in the case of the Palestinian population of Gaza, be imposed on Egypt, which is something that the Biden administration had looked into. It's something that the Israelis have long dreamed of doing. By accepting that, the Egyptians effectively accept that they have no sovereign control over their territory. And that is, I think, something that is a very clear red line for the Egyptians, because it undoes that entire bargain that was made with the peace agreement. Not to mention all of the sort of economic and security implications that come along with that. But as a matter of principle, it is also something the Egyptians are not going to accept. So nobody's on board with this idea. And you'd obviously need a lot of partners to try to make it happen and go along with it. And they're just not there for it.
Yeah, no, thanks. And as you mentioned, Egypt, Yousef, it strikes me as well that, going back to the start of that peace to 1978, the Camp David Accords, there is language in the Camp David Accords about Palestinian statehood and sovereignty that, of course, was never realized. So to some extent, that is still an open book. And that's a piece of that deal that I think we rarely touch on. Also, of course, as you point out, there has been a lot of pushback from the Arab world to Donald Trump's proposed ethnic cleansing, to Israel's debate and discussion in that regard. There was a statement that was put out, a joint statement of Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Arab League, and the Palestinian Authority. And I mean, one of the things we touch on in the paper is the damage that this conflict and that US support for unconditional support for Israel is doing both to regional stability and to US relations with the Arab world and with countries in the region, and I think many countries around the world beyond that. But before we get to that, I just want to drill down on one more aspect of this Trump statement of taking ownership, because I think it's the case to some extent that even if the US is not physically taking ownership of Gaza, what Donald Trump has done this week by saying that publicly is, even more than was already the case with Joe Biden by providing the arms, taken ownership, taken American ownership of whatever the outcome is now in Gaza, whether it is a flow of humanitarian assistance and a reconstruction and an eventual sovereignty or Palestinian state, or whatever the just and lasting peace is, or whether it is decades of misery, or whether it is ethnic cleansing. Hasn't, just by simply saying this, Donald Trump essentially taken American ownership of the situation in Gaza, even more than was already the case. And doesn't that also now create further perils for America in the region and around the world, as well as essentially tying us, for better or worse, to the outcome?
Well, I don't know what this means, right? For America to take ownership of Gaza, right? What does that even mean? We have the rollout of this policy, which came in a statement that was apparently written into Donald Trump's comments shortly before the press conference at which it was made, was clearly not thought out. Within 24 hours, we already have a number of different administration officials saying all kinds of different things about it. Donald Trump says we're going to, take ownership of Gaza, but also, and we're going to do a job with it and create, all these amazing things there. But we're not going to pay for it, and we're not going to have boots on the ground. So what does that even mean? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. And yet, it's not gonna happen. But at the same time, I think the fact that you have an American president speaking like this in a way that so obviously disregards the self-determination, sovereignty of another people, and talking about territory that is not sovereign American territory as something that the United States could just lay claim to. This is a really big problem, right? This is the kind of stuff that it was done by a foreign leader. We would be calling them a rogue state, right? That doesn't play by the international rules, and that is just trying to throw their weight around and destroy and take over those around them. And the scary thing is, Gaza's just the most recent territory, like this month, that Donald Trump has talked about America taking control of, whether it's Greenland or Panama or Canada. The normalization of outright American imperialism that has come from the bully pulpit in the last 3 weeks is something we really need to be alarmed about, and I think talking about. And this feeds into one of the themes in your paper, right? Which is sort of the collapse of this rules-based order and how much U.S. support for Israel has contributed to American double standards and kind of steps that the United States is taking against this order, as recently as today with further sanctions on the International Criminal Court.
Right, but I mean, that's, to be fair, not just something that has happened in the last 3 weeks under Donald Trump. That is something that you can pull a thread on, and I think we can just look at the Biden administration, right, where the United States disregarded international law, as many have pointed out, in its provision of arms in the first place, vetoed a number of UN resolutions, and did all it could to argue against the eligibility, for example, or the relevance of the International Criminal Court, tried to push back on the International Court of Justice, the World Court, and its processes, leaned on other countries, both behind the scenes and in public, to pull away and to maintain their support for Israel, has told some countries that it will not respect legal rulings from within those countries, when it comes to, for example, withholding parts for Israeli fighter jets. And, of course, has also, I mean, there's even under the Biden administration, the US began to take steps that would lead to the sanctioning of Spain, our NATO ally, simply because they refused to allow port calls for US ships carrying weapons to Israel. So these are all examples that, yes, Donald Trump is now, talking about Panama and Greenland, but I would argue that what we're really seeing under the Trump administration in that regard is an expansion of what the Biden administration was already doing, and what started with a disrespect for international law for the rules-based order when it comes to Palestine. That Palestine essentially has become a canary in the coal mine, or a leading indicator, or whatever you want to call it, for the US attitude towards the world. And, not to get ahead of ourselves, but also for US domestic civil rights. And that's an important part of this as well. That at the same time that we are tugging away at the international rules-based order to ensure that there is no accountability for Israel's actions, to ensure that we can continue to flow arms to Israel, to ensure that they can continue to pursue their ethnic cleansing projects in Gaza, and increasingly in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, that there is at the same time this effort that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months to repress speech at campuses and universities, whether that is Congress hauling presidents of universities in front of them to be insulted, decried, and then forced out of office, whether that is corporate America deciding to fire employees for something as simple as, in one case, I think it was bringing cupcakes with watermelons on them to work, or whether it is, the public sphere. And now we are seeing those very same tactics that were practiced and honed on the Palestine question under Biden being applied more broadly. The shutting down of free debate and discussion in government on a whole wide range of things. The shutting down, or the attempts to shut down, organizations, not only those focused on Palestine, but those focused on fossil fuels, those focused on climate justice, those focused on all sorts of rights. And so, to my mind, this is, and Palestine is, an important issue for all of us in America to think about, and to think about honestly, not only because of what it represents in its own regard, but because of how much seems to follow, how much of a almost sort of an experimental ground it is for those in American politics who want to limit our democracy and who want to cut down on our free speech.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I want to touch on some of the domestic stuff for sure, but I also want to say on this question of sort of, the pulling apart of this rules-based order in America and Israel's role on it. You're absolutely right. This doesn't start with Trump. In fact, the Biden administration in 2020, when they, or 2021, whenever it is that they had begun, one of the first things that they wanted to do is reverse a lot of the things that the Trump administration had done to kind of destroy its relationships with the international community and with its allies and so on and so forth. But one of the things it took them a very, very long time to reverse is sanctions on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. This is not something that they really wanted to reverse, and it took them forever to sort of lift those, and they've always been opposed to the court in any way being involved. And this is, of course, much older than Biden and Trump too, right? The Obama administration, we can talk about, data points from that time. But I also want to suggest that this is not simply about the U.S. relationship with Israel. It's about the United States also wanting to be above the law. And I think that this is something that is important. The United States was never a fan of the ICC long before it became about protecting Israel. It was also about wanting to ensure that American soldiers would have the freedom of action and never be subject to the jurisdiction of any sort of non-American military justice, right? And that's been the case of, that's been the position of U.S. administrations for a long time. And there are many other things that we can point to where the United States has, on the one hand, spoken about how it wants to lead the free world and speak about this norms-based, values-based international order that it feels is good for the United States and protects itself and its allies and global prosperity and what have you. But on the other hand, it hasn't really wanted to be a full participant in that order. It has not wanted to subject itself to the same rules, right? Even though many of its allies have been more willing to do so. And some of that has to do with Israel, but some of it also is about the United States wanting to be sort of above the law. And I think that tension has been there for a long time. One of the things that's happening now is that it's becoming much easier and much clearer to sort of say, well, this international order from Washington's perspective, it's not really working for us, so we're just gonna ignore it. We're gonna pretend it doesn't exist. It provides no value for us. And of course, Trump is doing that, loud and clear, talking about taking over this country, that country, starting fights with NATO allies left and right. This is one of the things that, as I was reading through your paper, I was thinking about. We are in a moment where the world is changing, and the old order will not have the relevance going forward that it did previously. And how we think about an American national interest in that context, and also how we think about advocating for the rights of Palestinians, I think changes also with those kinds of global shifts. On the domestic stuff, I think this is super important, and it's something that has been escalating over recent years. And yes, of course, it's going into overdrive now with Trump. But its origins are much deeper than that. The U.S.-Israel relationship, I think, has a lot to do with this historically, especially when we talk about all of the kind of anti-terrorism law regimes that have been created over the years, how important that the U.S.-Israel relationship has been to the creation and development of those legal regimes, and the way in which many of those laws have been used to target Palestinians above anyone else. And that, of course, goes back many, many decades. But an important thing that I think we need to point out about the current moment that we're living in is that a lot of the repression, and I think there's no better word for it, that we are seeing right now, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, targeting people who speak up for Palestine, or as you noted, bring cupcakes with a watermelon on them to work, right? Is because there are a lot of people realizing that U.S. support for Israel doesn't make sense. That's one of the main reasons that we are seeing this right now. There was a time, and you pointed this out as well, where U.S. support for Israel was not something that was really questioned. It was just kind of taken as a given, right? And that it was, as good and as American as apple pie. It's just something that we do, right? We support Israel, we give them weapons, and that's just makes sense for American foreign policy. Not everybody is on board with that anymore, particularly when you look at public opinion and when you look especially at a younger generation of the American public as well. And so what's started to happen is that there are more and more voices that are willing to openly challenge this policy. And to prevent change in that regard, and to maintain U.S. support for Israel and this consensus, you have to either defend U.S. support for Israel, and if you can't defend it, you have to go on the attack against the critics. And what we've seen over recent years is that the Israeli government and their supporters in the United States and elsewhere have gone to the point, particularly in the West, where you can't make a valid argument in defense of what Israel is doing. You just can't. People are able to see what's happening on the ground. They see that Israel has no real vision for actually permitting Palestinian self-determination in any form. And the only thing that they offer is apartheid or now genocide and ethnic cleansing. These are not defensible things. But to maintain American support in light of that, at a time where there's growing criticism of it, you need to crack down on this criticism. And so we are seeing more and more of that, and it's only going to escalate, by the way. It's only going to escalate. And in the process, right, because if you look in all of these different places where contention around U.S. support for Israel is taking place, it's never sort of horizontal contention. It's almost always top down. It's always, government officials cracking down, university administrators cracking down, donors with billions of dollars in backing calling university administrators and saying, hey, arrest your students or crack down and what have you. Laws that are being passed and so on. Employees that are being fired by their employers. And as this continues, it's only going to get more obvious, more heavy-handed, and do more damage to the kind of norms and principles that have mattered in liberal society. And we're ultimately going to get to a breaking point. And the question is just at what point is that?
So, I mean, I think you and I are both coming from a similar perspective when it comes to support for the rules-based international order, for the idea of rules-based norms in our own system as well, and the freedoms that we enjoy. And I think looking at that picture, looking both at the international rules-based order and at the current U.S. domestic context, I mean, I have to say one of the quotations that's been coming to mind a lot for me recently is that quote from Sir Edward Grey on the eve of World War I, where he said, the lamps are going out across Europe, and I think we shall not see them lit again in our lifetimes. And it does have that sort of feeling to it when you think about the state of the rules-based order and American democracy, that the lamps are going out all around the world. But I think there are many, and there's a question here in the chat that I want to touch on, which is from Karina, who asks, do you see a concrete opportunity to change the Republicans' attitude towards Palestine-Israel based on the America First policy? And of course, in that context, even if you don't support, if you're not, a big fan of the rules-based international order, if you don't think there should be accountability through the ICC, I think there's still an America First argument here that it's useful to talk about. Because the support the US has been providing to Israel, the unconditional support, is doing damage to US alliances around the world, which remain important regardless of whether you think there should be a broader international rules-based order. America still needs alliances and partnerships to function, particularly in an era of strategic competition, of relative decline, let's be honest. And then, of course, there's also a hard defense issue here as well, right? I mean, the US expended in the course of a few hours of missile defense for Israel a year's worth of production of the high-end SM-3, the Standard Missile 3, which is an air missile defense, interceptor. And of course, we've also seen repeated US deployments. We've seen for example, carrier strike groups deployed from the Pacific to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. At one point, the US had no carrier presence in the Pacific because all of the assets were in the Middle East, deterring further conflict and protecting Israel. We've seen US forces, troops killed in Jordan about a year ago, just over a year ago, conducting an effort to interdict supplies from Iran to Hezbollah. We saw almost, the friendly fire shoot down a couple of months ago of a naval F-18 jet as the US is conducting operations to bomb Yemen, which for me has been one of the great ironies here, right? Having spent years in government sort of trying to put an end to the bombardment of Yemen by the US, for the US now to step in and say, we are going to be the ones bombarding Yemen, but that's a separate issue. And so it seems that there is that hard defense case as well to make, that if you actually want to put America first, this is a distraction. This is a toll on our resources. We haven't, of course, talked about our financial resources as well, right? At the same time that, we look at the Los Angeles fires or the North Carolina, Hurricane Helene aftermath, in both cases, where the US government turned around and through FEMA said, well, we can provide everyone who lost their home with a check for $770. At the same year that we are providing over $20 billion in security assistance to Israel, a country that has a GDP, per capita GDP, comparable to most countries in Western Europe. And so, trying to, I mean, even setting aside the rules-based order, all of these things, it seems like even if your argument is America first, this ain't America first. This is not it. And so I think, just in answer to Karina's question, I think there is a concrete opportunity there. But would love to hear from you as well, how you think, the Republican base in particular may be thinking about this, because I think there is a divergence there from where a lot of the Republican establishment might be.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And over the past couple of years, what we've seen in the region is really remarkable in terms of the level of American involvement. As you noted, the number of assets that had to be moved in, the number of American troops that have been exposed to risk, just to be there to defend Israel. The Israeli prime minister often comes to Congress, and one of the things that he is most fond of saying is, thank you for giving us the tools so that Israel can defend itself by itself. This has been sort of one of the principles of Israeli military doctrine, is that it doesn't want to have to rely on anyone else to defend itself. And it's never really been true. But it's never been less true than in the past year or so, where really from the very outset of the war, the United States moved heaven and earth to support the Israeli military, both in terms of funding and weapons and America's military assets and intelligence cooperation. I mean, it was unprecedented in terms of the American involvement in Israel's so-called defense. And so, yeah, this is not really America first at all. I think the point about sort of engaging with Republicans and does this provide sort of an opening, it might, and it depends, I think on the individual. I think it's always worth exploring. And what I find is that regardless to your sort of ideological orientation politically, when people in the United States become aware of the amount of money that is being sent to Israel, they're kind of shocked. They're kind of shocked to learn this, and that their government is okay with it and shipping their tax dollars over to a foreign country, even if they don't necessarily have a really strong stance towards the Israelis or Palestinians. They're offended by it. Now you are going to have some, we're talking here about the Republicans, and there is of course a spectrum, right, of Republicans. There's going to be some folks who tell you like, look, this is this is what God wants, right? And those people, I'm not sure you're going to be able to argue with them a whole lot. But that's certainly not everybody. The other thing that I would say is we don't talk enough about how much U.S. military support for Israel has perpetuated the conflict, so to speak, right? Or put off a negotiated resolution. Because we give billions of dollars every year from our tax dollars to Israel. Israel is not a poor country, by the way. It can afford to buy some of these weapons from the United States, but we're handing it out to them, right? If they had to buy their own weapons in Israel, okay, billions of dollars worth, there'd have to be a public debate about where that money is coming from, which social programs are going to be cut to be able to fund it, and whether or not it really justifies the policies that it's supporting, right? And those are conversations within Israeli politics that do not happen because there's an open tap from the American taxpayer. And it has in many ways enabled the race to the right in Israeli politics, because there's no cost to constant militarism in Israeli politics, and the American taxpayer has had a lot to do with that.
I think that's a great point, and I would add, first of all, you've touched on an issue near and dear to my own heart, which is, the point that essentially America has pursued a policy with Israel of security for peace. We will ensure your security, and that gives you the space, the security, the stability to make concessions to the Palestinians. Whereas, in fact, and I've argued this inside of government and outside of government, we have provided so much of a security guarantee that Israel has felt it doesn't have to worry about the Palestinians. It can ignore the plight of all of these people and essentially, build some walls. But eventually you're going to get, with the US backing, the normalization that you want in the region. And so, you can do what you like and security is never going to be an issue, which is an interesting contrast, I think, to at the same time, this Israeli psychology of permanent insecurity. And I think, part of the problem there is that you actually, or part of the reason why security for peace has failed, is that you never actually get to that point of ultimate security. But part of the problem is that it just, creates this guarantee that allows Israel to keep acting however it wants, not only with regards to the Palestinians, of course, but with regards to Lebanon, with regards to, other countries in the region. The other thing, of course, that your comments remind me of is that it's not just that the United States is providing money to procure US weapons, but that, even under the current memorandum of understanding between the US and Israel that provides $3.3 billion a year in a regular year of foreign military financing, 20% of that can be used in something called offshore procurement. So, which means that Israel can take that US taxpayer money and rather than buying US weapons, can invest in it in its own defense industrial base. And Israel, of course, is now a top 10 weapons exporter around the world. And I actually had a conversation with a senior official in the US defense industry over the course of the last year, who said to me, we don't like this. We're funding our own competition. This is a company that in that case makes drones, makes UAVs, and Israel is a leading exporter and is often, head to head with American manufacturers when it comes to weapons exports of, in particular, UAVs, also of military electronics and a number of other systems. And this is US taxpayer money that, set aside the moral question here, but even as a practical matter, why are we funding our competition? How does that make any sense as value for dollars?
Yeah, and it's it wasn't always that way. Offshore procurement is a more recent thing. I mean, it's been several decades now, and it's beginning to phase out. I think at one point it was up to 26% of the total amount of U.S. aid to Israel, the military financing that they could use in their domestic industry. And it's important, I think, for listeners here to know that there's only one country that gets an exception in terms of being able to use American taxpayer dollars through the military financing program in their own domestic industry. That country is Israel. Nobody else gets that exception. Our tax dollars helped build the Israeli military industry into the global player that it is today. On a per capita basis, Israel is one of the largest, maybe even the largest arms exporters in the world in terms of revenue that it makes. And the revenue that it makes out of arms exports has reached something like 12 or 15 billion dollars annually in recent years, okay, which is nearly 4 to 5 times the amount of money that they get from us in military aid, right? If you're turning around and you're selling $15 billion worth of weapons around the world, why are we giving you aid at all? Why are you still taking handouts from the United States? And why is American taxpayer dollars being used to create competition for American weapons manufacturers? I mean, all these are very, very valid questions that I think are important to ask. And they're all within that framework, right? That sort of national interest framework that for the folks who don't necessarily connect with the values piece, it might be more useful for them to think about the framing within that interest frame.
And recognizing we only have about 8 minutes left, there are a lot of questions. But just to one final note on that as well. I mean, you mentioned this sort of exceptionalism, that Israel gets this offshore procurement authority that it spends within its own country. Of course, it's not the only exceptionalism, and we can also talk about the exceptionalism that Israel seems to get formally or informally to the application of US laws. So, for example, the Leahy law, which says that you cannot provide military assistance to a foreign security force that is credibly alleged to have committed gross violations of human rights. But there have been a number of other examples that have been raised, particularly in the course of the last year, where it seems like there is just an unwillingness of both the executive branch and Congress to apply US law to Israel. And I do think that that as well is an example of how this unconditional support is not only not in America's interest, but actually warps our very processes, warps our rule of law and our own internal accountability systems in ways that, again, to look at the transition from Biden to Trump, then get applied more broadly. You create this sort of, hole in the dam that just sort of expands, but no one is willing to fix that hole when it is starting with that unconditional support to Israel. No one seems to be willing to raise their hand and say, this is starting here, but this is going to become a problem that weakens all of our legal, judicial frameworks. So
certainly.
So I do want to come to some of the questions, just looking through them. I think the one that has come up the most, just looking through the theme here, is a lot of people saying, what can we do about it? And I think that's a very valid question that we're sitting here talking about. Well, here are all these reasons why what we're doing is not in America's interest. So I think it's fair to ask, okay, so I'm an American citizen in particular. What can I do to respond? How can I address this?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that people can be involved in creating change on this front. One of them is just through direct public education, which I continue to think is one of the most important things. As I noted earlier, most people who don't really have a horse in this race, so to speak, or not really sort of defining themselves as actively pro-Israel or actively in support of Palestinians or what have you. When they learn about this relationship and how unseemly it is, they're pretty disgusted. And they too want to mobilize to create some sort of change. So I think education about this remains one of the most important things that will continue to create the space for change for years to come. It's something that has to continue to happen, and of course cannot be done on its own. The other thing that is as important, if not more important, is we need political engagement on this issue. People sometimes wonder, well, you have this shift in public support. You have this shift in public opinion. Why doesn't it translate to a shift in policy? And that's because policy is not a reflection of public opinion. It'd be nice if it was, but that's not the only variable that leads to the creation of policy. Policy is created by individuals who need to be reelected into office. And they have their own interests as well that factor into the decisions that they make. Creating connections and relationships with policymakers and elected officials and developing and maintaining those relations over time are central to being able to shape policy in the direction that you want to see. And this is not the only issue where the public opinion reality doesn't really match up with the policy reality. One looks, for example, at the question of gun control. There's huge majorities of the American public that want to see some steps in the direction of gun control, whether it's background checks or what have you. And there's very little movement on these things. And that's because public opinion does not immediately translate to policy. And in between, there's a lot of intervening variables, including interest groups. So it's important to be involved in the policymaking process in that way. You could do it in a lot of different ways in your individual capacity. It's everywhere from writing your member of Congress to becoming a member of Congress. And to supporting a member of Congress in their election campaigns, and not just in Congress, by the way, but at every level of government. So I think we need those two components in tandem to continue working together: the public education piece, but also the political engagement and involvement piece, which is going to be crucial to creating any kind of change on this front.
No, thanks, Yousef. And you've actually made a fair amount of, I think, what would have been my pitch anyway for me there, right? As you know, a new policy is one of those public interest groups and is trying to, organize around this and, is engaging in that daily effort of lobbying members of Congress, of lobbying the executive branch, and of playing in that election campaign and political campaign space. And of course, all of that takes resources and takes money as well. But I think, a couple of other things I point in there, or maybe which go as well to your public education point, is that I think part of the issue here is that the framing is also important. And what reverberates with, one audience or community is not necessarily what will reverberate with another. And I think we have to be, attentive to who we are talking with in terms of what argument we are making. We were talking before about the way that debate has been shut down. And one of the ways that debate has been shut down has been by saying any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And this is particularly absurd in a context in which you have, a lot of vocal American Jewish groups standing up and protesting. But I think one way also is to point out that actually what we're doing is not in America's interest. And I don't know, who, for example, some of these other groups are advocating for, what interests they are representing. But if we're just talking about American interest, we should be able to have a open discussion. And here are, a whole list of ways, for example, in this paper, of how this does not reflect American interest. I think the other aspect here as well is coalition building. And this goes back to one of the points we were making about how, what starts on Palestine very quickly expands to encompass, agendas against other groups, against other interests that chip away at the international rules-based order and that chip away at our own freedoms and democracy. And I think to the extent that we can continue to make that point and also build out the relationships with all of the other stakeholders who are concerned, whether they are Republicans who are concerned about freedom of speech from a libertarian perspective, whether they are Democrats who are worried about freedom to organize on certain issues within the labor movement, for example. I think that, there is something here for everyone, because at the end of the day, I would like to think that there are such things as both American values and American interests. And hopefully that is something that all of us can rally around protecting when we see that they are being set aside and sacrificed on behalf of a country whose agenda does not always align with ours. So we are at the end of our time. I want to thank you very much, Yousef, for joining us. I want to thank Coco Tate, our amazing event organizer, who put this together, and thank all of our audience for joining us. Please do visit us at anewpolicy.org, and thank you all very much. We'll see you next time.